The Last Lion, Winston Spencer Churchill, Defender of the Realm, 1940 to 1965, by William Manchester and Paul Reed. Introduction. Host, have you ever wondered what it's like to stand alone against the world? I mean truly alone, with everything you love, everything you believe in, hanging by a thread. Imagine this, it's the summer of 1940. A shadow has fallen over Europe. Nation after nation has collapsed under the weight of a monstrous war machine. France, the great bastion of liberty, has just surrendered. From the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border, a single terrifying flag now flies. The world holds its breath, convinced that the end is near. And in that moment, one man stands in the breach. He is 65 years old. Many have written him off as a relic of a bygone era, a political outcast with a history of spectacular failures. He's stubborn, sentimental, and has a fondness for cigars and brandy that would worry any doctor. Yet, on June 21, 1940, this one man, Winston Churchill, becomes the most visible, most vital figure in the free world. He is not just the Prime Minister of Great Britain, he is the defender of a realm that stretches across a quarter of the globe, and in a larger sense, the last guardian of an idea, the very idea of freedom itself. What happens next is the stuff of legend. It's a story of defiance, of words that mobilized a language and sent it into battle, of a spirit so indomitable that it could stare into the abyss and not blink. This is the story we're going to explore today, through the final volume of a masterpiece of biography, The Last Lion, Defender of the Realm, 1940 to 1965. This book is a monumental work, a project so vast that its original author, the brilliant historian William Manchester, dedicated decades of his life to it. After writing 2 magnificent volumes, Manchester's health sadly failed him. For years, the world waited, wondering if the final chapter of Churchill's story would ever be told. But Manchester, in an act of profound trust, passed the torch to his friend and fellow writer, Paul Reed, who took Manchester's immense research, a treasure trove of notes, interviews, and documents, and completed this epic tale. And what a tale it is! By the end of our journey today, you will understand not just what Churchill did, but who he was. You will discover the secret of his incredible energy, the source of his unshakable courage, and the simple, powerful principles that allowed him to lead his people through their darkest hour. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a masterclass in leadership, resilience, and the power of the human spirit. So settle in, and let's begin the story of The Last Lion. Book Summary. Host, to truly understand the man who stood against Hitler, you first have to understand the world he inherited, and the world he created around himself. In the summer of 1940, as Churchill took the reins of power, he was already an old man by the standards of the day. His staff at No. 10 Downing Street simply called him the Old Man. And he was a force of nature. He worked hours that would break a man half his age, often dictating memos from his bed in the morning, a cigar in one hand, a glass of white wine on his breakfast tray. He had a lisp and a growl that could make his words hard to follow, but his eyes, sometimes as warm as sunshine, other times as cold as ice, left no doubt as to his mood. He could be shockingly inconsiderate, roaring at a typist for a minor mistake, only to forgive her moments later with a surprising act of kindness. He was a man of contradictions, sentimental yet ruthless, a lover of tradition who embraced radical new ideas, a blue-blooded aristocrat who felt a deep, genuine connection with the common man. He never rode a bus, never carried cash, and once confessed that the only cooking he'd ever mastered was boiling an egg, and even that he'd only seen done. His life ran on a precise, personal clock, lubricated by a steady intake of Paul Roger champagne, Hine brandy, and Johnny Walker Red Label whiskey. He ignored doctors' advice, believing that the way to lose the war was to force the British public onto a diet of milk and oatmeal. Yet, this indulgence was paired with a work ethic that was nothing short of astonishing. His mind never stopped. His daughter Mary said that idleness was a concept unknown to him. Every waking moment was spent working, thinking, planning. This was the man who, on May 10, 1940, became Prime Minister. It was the very day that Hitler, after months of eerie silence and the phony war, finally unleashed his blitzkrieg on the West. As German tanks and planes stormed into Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg, the old world order began to crumble. The Allied strategy, led by the French High Command, was disastrously flawed. The French generals, haunted by the memory of World War I, believed history would repeat itself. They expected the German attack to come through the plains of Belgium, just as it had in 1914. They massed their best armies there, including the British Expeditionary Force, ready to meet the German onslaught head-on. They put their faith in the Maginot Line, a massive chain of steel and concrete fortifications that guarded the Franco-German border, believing it to be impenetrable. But they had forgotten one crucial lesson of history: the enemy rarely does what you expect. They dismissed the Ardennes forest, a dense, hilly, and wooded region, as impassable for a modern army. Impenetrable, they called it. But it was here, through this supposedly safe sector, that the Germans launched their main assault. While the Allies marched north into Belgium, a massive German force of tanks and infantry sliced through the Ardennes, crossed the Meuse River, and poured into France, completely outflanking the Allied armies. The French front was not just broken, it was shattered. The speed of the German advance was terrifying, revolutionary. It was a new kind of warfare, and the French had no answer. Within days, the German panzer divisions had reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two and trapping nearly 1 million soldiers, British, French, and Belgian, in a pocket with their backs to the sea. The news that reached London was confused, then alarming, then catastrophic. On May 15, Churchill received a frantic call from the French Premier, Paul Reynaud. "We have been defeated," Reynaud cried. "We are beaten. We have lost the battle." Churchill, his mind still conditioned by the slow, grinding pace of the First World War, couldn't believe it. "Surely it can't have happened so soon," he replied. But it had. He flew to Paris and found a government in panic. Officials were burning papers in the gardens of the Quai d'Orsay. When Churchill asked the French commander, General Gamelin, where the Strategic Reserve Army was, the force meant to counter just such a breakthrough, Gamelin simply shook his head and said, "Aucune, there was none." In that moment, Churchill was, in his own words, dumbfounded. The full scale of the disaster was laid bare. France, the great military power of Europe, the nation that was supposed to bear the brunt of the land war, was collapsing. With the northern armies trapped and the Germans closing in, a miracle was needed. That miracle had a name: Dunkirk. In one of the most remarkable feats in military history, a hastily assembled fleet of ships was dispatched to the beaches of Dunkirk to rescue the stranded army. It wasn't just naval destroyers and transport ships. It was a civilian armada, fishing boats, yachts, ferries, pleasure craft of every shape and size, piloted by ordinary men who sailed into a hell of bombs and artillery fire to bring their soldiers home. For 9 days and nights, under relentless attack from the German Luftwaffe, this mosquito armada worked its miracle. They rescued not just the British Army, but 112,000 French soldiers as well, plucking a total of 338,226 men from the jaws of defeat. They came home, but they came home with nothing. They had left behind all their equipment: tanks, artillery, rifles, trucks. Britain had its army back, but it was an army without weapons. On June 4, Churchill stood before the House of Commons to report on the colossal military disaster. He offered no false hope, no easy comfort. Wars, he told them bluntly, are not won by evacuations. But then, in words that would echo through the ages, he laid out the path forward. He spoke of defiance, of resilience, of a refusal to surrender, no matter the cost. "We shall go on to the end," he declared, his voice a low growl of defiance. "We shall fight in France, we shall fight on the seas and oceans, we shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air, we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall never surrender." It was a promise, a challenge, and a prophecy. And it would soon be tested. With France's final surrender on June 22, Britain stood alone. Hitler, convinced the war was over, expected a peace offer from London. He even drafted generous terms, believing that Britain, facing annihilation, would have no other choice but to accept. He did not understand the man he was dealing with. He did not understand the people Churchill led. When Hitler made his last appeal to reason in a Reichstag speech, offering peace, the BBC's response, guided by Churchill, was swift and blunt: "We hurl it right back at your evil-smelling teeth." The battle for Britain was about to begin. Hitler's plan to invade Britain, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, depended on one critical factor: air superiority. The German Luftwaffe had to destroy the Royal Air Force, both in the air and on the ground. Without control of the skies, the German invasion fleet would be decimated by the Royal Navy. The man tasked with defending Britain's skies was Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, a quiet, difficult, and brilliant commander. For years, he had been building a revolutionary air defense system, one that combined modern fighter planes, the elegant Spitfire and the rugged Hurricane, with a new, secret technology: radar. A chain of radar stations along Britain's coast could detect incoming German aircraft while they were still miles away, giving the RAF precious minutes to scramble their fighters and intercept the enemy. The battle began in July 1940, over the English Channel, as the Luftwaffe tried to lure the RAF into a war of attrition. Then, in August, the Germans launched their main assault, Adlerangriff, Eagle attack, targeting the RAF's airfields, command centers, and aircraft factories. For weeks, the fate of Britain hung on the courage and skill of a few hundred young pilots. They were outnumbered, exhausted, flying sortie after sortie, day after day. They came from all walks of life, from every part of the Commonwealth and beyond: Poles, Czechs, Canadians, Australians, Americans, all fighting under the banner of the RAF. Churchill, who often visited the command bunkers to watch the battles unfold on the plotting tables, captured the essence of their sacrifice in another of his immortal phrases. "Never in the field of human conflict," he told the nation, "was so much owed by so many to so few." By early September, the RAF was on the verge of breaking. The relentless German attacks on the airfields were taking a devastating toll. Fighter Command was losing more pilots and planes than it could replace. Victory was in the Luftwaffe's grasp. And then, Hitler made a fatal mistake. On the night of August 24, a few lost German bombers, aiming for industrial targets outside London, accidentally dropped their bombs on the city itself. Churchill, seeing an opportunity, immediately ordered a retaliatory raid on Berlin. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was immense. Hitler, enraged that the British had dared to bomb his capital, made a fateful decision. He ordered the Luftwaffe to switch its attacks from the RAF airfields to London itself, to terrorize the civilian population into submission. This was the beginning of the Blitz. For 76 consecutive nights, from September 7 onward, London was pounded by bombs. The city burned. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Thousands were killed. But in shifting his focus, Hitler had given the RAF the breathing room it desperately needed. The battered airfields were repaired, the exhausted pilots rested. Fighter command survived. The Blitz was a time of unimaginable horror, but it was also a time of incredible courage. Ordinary Londoners, shopkeepers, bus drivers, nurses, firemen, showed a resilience that astonished the world. They slept in subway tunnels, pulled their neighbors from burning buildings, and went to work the next morning, stepping over the debris of their own homes. The King and Queen refused to leave Buckingham Palace, even after it was bombed, with the Queen famously saying, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." And Churchill was there with them, a constant presence in the bombed-out streets, his cigar jutting out in defiance, his V for Victory sign becoming a global symbol of resistance. He drew his strength, he said, from the people he led. He believed the British people had the lion heart, he only provided the roar. By the end of 1940, it was clear that Britain would not break. The invasion was postponed, and then postponed indefinitely. The Battle of Britain was won. But the war was far from over. Britain was still alone, its resources stretched to the breaking point. The U-boat menace in the Atlantic threatened to sever its lifeline to the outside world. Food, weapons, and supplies were desperately needed. Churchill knew that Britain's survival and ultimate victory depended on one thing: the entry of the United States into the war. He had been cultivating a relationship with President Franklin D. Roosevelt since the first day of his premiership, sending hundreds of secret telegrams, pleading, cajoling, and warning of the consequences if America did not act. Roosevelt was sympathetic, but he faced a deeply isolationist country, a public determined to stay out of another European war. Slowly, carefully, Roosevelt began to move America closer to the conflict. He arranged the destroyers for bases deal, providing Britain with 50 old warships in exchange for leases on naval bases. He pushed through the Lend-Lease Act, a brilliant piece of legislation that allowed America to supply Britain with billions of dollars worth of war materials, declaring that the U.S. must become the great arsenal of democracy. It was, Churchill said, the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. The relationship between the two leaders, conducted mostly through telegrams and the occasional visit from a trusted envoy like Harry Hopkins, became the central axis of the war. They were two very different men, the aristocratic, romantic Churchill and the patrician, pragmatic Roosevelt, but they forged a bond of trust and shared purpose that would change the course of history. In August 1941, they met for the first time as leaders, in a secret rendezvous on a warship off the coast of Newfoundland. There, they drafted the Atlantic Charter, a declaration of principles for a better world after the war, a world of self-determination, free trade, and freedom from fear and want. It was a noble vision, but the world was still a very dark place. In June 1941, Hitler had stunned the world by invading his erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union. Churchill, a lifelong anti-communist who had once tried to strangle Bolshevism at its birth, did not hesitate. He immediately went on the radio and pledged Britain's full support to Russia. "If Hitler invaded hell," he told his private secretary, "I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The Grand Alliance was born. Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, three powers with deeply conflicting ideologies, were now united by a common enemy. The entry of Russia and, finally, America into the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 transformed the conflict. Britain was no longer alone. But victory was still a long way off, and the path was filled with setbacks and disagreements. There were bitter arguments over strategy, Churchill favoring an attack on what he called the soft underbelly of Europe through Italy and the Balkans, the Americans insisting on a direct cross-channel invasion of France. There was the ever-present tension with Stalin, who constantly demanded a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on his armies. Through it all, Churchill was the driving force, the central figure who held the alliance together. He traveled tirelessly, crossing the Atlantic multiple times in unheated bombers, journeying to Moscow, Cairo, and Tehran, attending conference after conference, always pushing, always planning, always looking for the next move on the great chessboard of the war. He made mistakes. The disastrous raid on Dieppe in 1942, the agonizingly slow and bloody campaign in Italy, the political turmoil in Greece, all bore the mark of his sometimes impulsive and overly optimistic nature. But he never lost sight of the ultimate goal. He never stopped believing in victory. And in the end, that victory came. On June 6, 1944, the greatest amphibious force ever assembled landed on the beaches of Normandy, and the liberation of Europe began. 11 months later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Churchill had led his nation from the brink of annihilation to the pinnacle of victory. He was the hero, the savior, the man who had embodied the spirit of a nation. And then, just 2 months later, in the general election of July 1945, the British people voted him out of office. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable turn of events. But the people, exhausted by 6 years of war, were looking not to the past, but to the future. They wanted a new kind of Britain, a Britain of social security and national health care, and they believed the Labour Party was the party to deliver it. Churchill, the great war leader, was seen as a man of the past. The defeat was a crushing blow. "It may well be a blessing in disguise," Clementine told him. "At the moment," he replied, "it is certainly very well disguised." He was now in his 70s, an old man once again in the political wilderness. But he was not finished. As leader of the opposition, he remained a powerful voice in British politics. And on the world stage, he was more influential than ever. In a speech in Fulton, Missouri, in 1946, he warned of the new shadow falling over Europe, the shadow of Soviet expansionism. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he declared, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent." He had given the Cold War its name. He poured his energy into writing his magnificent 6-volume history of the war, a work that would earn him the Nobel Prize in Literature. He painted, he traveled, he raised racehorses. And he waited. In 1951, at the age of 76, he became Prime Minister once again. He served for 4 more years, grappling with the challenges of the atomic age, the decline of the British Empire, and his own failing health. In 1955, old and frail, he finally retired, leaving behind a legacy that is almost impossible to measure. He was a man of immense appetites and immense talents, a statesman, a soldier, a historian, a writer, and an artist. He was a man of courage, of vision, and of indomitable will. But above all, he was a leader, the man who, in the world's darkest hour, held the line, who refused to surrender, who showed what one person, armed with nothing but courage and words, can do. He was, and will forever be, the last lion. Commentary. As we come to the end of this incredible story, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what it all means. What are the lessons we can take from the life of Winston Churchill, especially in the world we live in today? The first, and perhaps most important, is the power of resilience. Churchill's career before 1940 was littered with failures. The disastrous Gallipoli campaign in World War I, his controversial tenure as Chancellor of the Exchequer, his years in the political wilderness in the 1930s by any conventional measure, he was a politician whose best days were behind him. But he never gave up. He learned from his mistakes, he held fast to his convictions, and when his moment came, he was ready. It's a powerful reminder that our past failures do not define our future success. The key is to never, ever give in. The second lesson is about the power of words. In an age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, it's easy to become cynical about language, to see it as just so much noise. But Churchill showed us that words, when wielded with passion, clarity, and conviction, can change the world. His speeches didn't just report on events, they shaped them. They gave a nation the courage to fight on when all seemed lost. They mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. It's a testament to the fact that what we say, and how we say it, matters. Finally, Churchill's story is a lesson in the complexity of leadership. He was not a perfect man. He was flawed, often difficult, and by today's standards, his views on race and empire are deeply problematic. But he was the right man for his time. He possessed the unique combination of courage, vision, and sheer bloody-mindedness that the moment demanded. It reminds us that leadership is not about perfection, it's about rising to the occasion, about being willing to bear the burden of responsibility when others shrink from it. So, what can a 17-year-old, standing at the threshold of their own life, take from all of this? I think it's this: believe in something. Stand for something. And when the time comes to defend what you believe in, do so with all the courage and conviction you can muster. You may not be called upon to stand against a tyrant, but you will face your own battles, your own challenges. And when you do, remember the old man with the cigar and the siren suit, the man who stood alone and refused to be broken. Remember the Last Lion. That was a summary of The Last Lion, Defender of the Realm, 1940 to 1965, by William Manchester and Paul Reed. We've touched on the great peaks and valleys of Churchill's war, but a summary is like looking at a mountain range from a distance. The real majesty, the true sense of scale, can only be experienced up close. The real magic of this story is in the details, in the quiet moments of doubt and the thunderous moments of defiance that you can only find within the pages of the book itself. This summary is a map, designed to show you the way. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or stirred your spirit, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just an act of learning, it's an experience, a journey into the heart of one of the most consequential lives ever lived. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if this journey into the life of a great leader has been valuable to you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. We have many more extraordinary books and lives to explore together on the Billionaire's Bookshelf, and you won't want to miss our next adventure. Let's keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving to be a little better every single day. Thank you for listening.